Welcome to the You're Not Crazy podcast, hosted by Jessica Knight, a certified life coach who specializes in healing from narcissistic and emotional abuse. This podcast is intended to help you identify manipulative and abusive behavior, set boundaries with yourself and others, and heal the relationship with yourself so you can learn to love in a healthy way. You can connect with Jessica and find additional resources, content, and coaching at emotionalabusecoach.com.
Hello, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Before I dive into the topic, I'm going to go over how you can work with me and what that looks like. I offer one-on-one coaching on a consistent basis, or also just on a one-off, which is called a validation call. I send you a bunch of questions beforehand so that way we can dive right in, because I know that, there's no way that we can get through everything in an hour, but my hope is that we can create some movement, and having the background certainly helps that. I have a Substack where I've been writing about a different topic every month. You can find that link in the show notes, or you can go to Substack and type in Jessica Knight Coaching. I also have a series of courses: How to Divorce a Narcissist, Documentation for Family Court, Emotional Abuse Breakthrough Course, and the Boundaries Deep Dive, and I'm working on a few more. Today I want to focus on something that I think that we all ask ourselves is like, why did they do this? Why can't they see the problem? Why can't they change? And when I left my relationship with my ex, I remember not feeling prepared at all what would come next. I thought it would give me a sense of peace because I didn't want to be in the relationship. The relationship was, I kept trying to leave this person and they kept trying to get me to stay. And every time I would try and leave, they would have all these promises, or they would bring in, another thing or another consideration. And when he finally basically, it seemed like he had to end it with me in order for him to feel the power and control. But he hadn't just given me an ultimatum. He gave me an ultimatum that I absolutely would never accept. And he knew that. And he said the only way forward in the relationship. So I'm sort of realizing that I'm going on a tangent, but to take a step back, what I want to talk about today is about when a relationship ends and you don't understand why you're wanting them back, and when our brains go into the second guessing of all of this. And because that's absolutely, in this little story that I wanted to frame, because that's exactly what happened to me. I didn't want to be in the relationship. And the ultimatum specifically was the only way to move forward. So basically, I had this big meltdown, a lot of blame. I thought this is one of the same meltdowns he's had. I was planning to go away and think about how to get out of this relationship, but then he dumped me in a text message. And he said the only way to move forward was for me to take full responsibility for everything that had gone wrong in the relationship. Every conflict, every misstep, every meltdown of his, every apology he gave me. He wanted me to absorb all of that blame, and so that he can preserve his version of the story and himself. And I said, no way. And then I proceeded to spend the next year after that trying to understand what happened, why it happened, how it could happen, how somebody thinks this way. How do they not see their behavior? How do they not see, the cycle they created? Why would anybody want me to take blame for everything? He had apologized and there had seemed to be genuine apologies, but now I have to take blame. I could not wrap my mind around it. And then he rewrote history. So I just want to be clear when I talk about this, and I'm going to talk about this, I think, at the end, probably too. When I say someone who couldn't love you back, because I'm going to touch on that, I don't mean someone who struggled to communicate or had trouble expressing emotions. I mean someone who lacked the capacity for real intimacy, even though they said they would. Someone who could imitate love, but not sustain it. Their version of connection is rooted in control, image, and self-preservation, but not actually mutual care. In other words, their love is about them. It's not about you. What followed after that wasn't peace at all. It was a tidal wave of the doubt, self-blame, grief. It was so heavy. It made me question if I was doing the right thing or making the right decision, by sort of holding on to my boundary and deciding that I don't want to do this anymore. He really had me question all of that. And I think when somebody that you love and someone you care about is blaming literally everything on you, it's really hard to not self-reflect and to think like, well, what if they're right? I missed him so badly. It was almost like I could feel it in every bone, even though he hurt me and brought up so much of my old trauma. And I would replay all our best moments, wondering if I'd imagined the worst ones or if I'd been irrational. I'd stay up late Googling terms like narcissistic collapse and splitting, trying to make sense of how somebody could switch from love bombing me literally 3 days before to emotionally tearing me down the next. And this is what it feels like when you love someone who couldn't love you back. This is a specific type of hell. And this connects to someone with a cluster B personality. And cluster B refers to a group of personality disorders, narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, antisocial, that are characterized by emotional volatility, manipulation, and lack of empathy, with a deep need of control. And I want to be blunt here. These are not just difficult personalities. These are people who fracture your sense of self. They build you up just to break you back down. They blur the line between love and fear, and they shift the ground under you until you question your memory. And I think the hardest part of all is that they make you feel like this is your fault. Everything is your fault. And before I continue, I want to basically just sort of talk a little bit for a second just about capacity, because I think this is one of the hardest things that I've ever had to reconcile and think through is somebody's capacity. Because when I think about capacity, I think about my capacity. I think about the way that I can, how much you can love and care for somebody and like basically what that looks like. And so for a long time, I held on to the belief that everyone has the same capacity to love. With the right support, the right effort, people could grow into a connection. Letting go of that belief felt like giving up on hope, but of all humanity. But the truth is that some people just don't have the same capacity. And that's not because they're unwilling, but because they're unable. Their emotional range is limited and their empathy does not run deep. Their connection is transactional. And I don't know exactly why he lacked that capacity, whether it was trauma, wiring, something else. But I do know this, is that as long as I believed he could love me, like I loved him, I stayed stuck trying to unlock something that wasn't there. And that's the importance of understanding cluster B and sort of trying to explore some of the traits around it, because these disorders often show up in subtle but overlapping ways. And one person may have several traits: charming like a narcissist, but explosive like somebody with BPD, evasive like somebody who's antisocial. And that like effect of numerous disorders together is what makes it so confusing. And the patterns don't just escalate, they repeat, they keep changing, and they leave you with this different kind of trauma that lives in your nervous system long after the relationship ends. It's really disorienting. But there's grief there, and I think it's the grief that nobody talks about, because you don't miss the person, you miss the illusion. You miss the person who told you that they loved everything about you, not the one who later mocked all of those same parts. And you miss the inside jokes or the trips that you planned or the way that they looked at you when they were trying to win you over. But you don't miss the rage and the blame and the emotional shutdowns. And your brain doesn't separate those things so easily, especially when you're trauma bonded. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor after one of our final arguments, replaying the conversation word for word, trying to figure out if I'd been too sensitive. I wasn't, but it took me months to believe that. I kept waiting for closure from the same person who thrived on keeping that door cracked open just enough to see if I was still checking. And I had to learn that closure wasn't going to come from him, even though I wanted even just an acknowledgement of the way he acted at the end was absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy, even if we use the mindset he was in. Because the end doesn't just look like the end. It starts a new kind of pain. And when you've been in a relationship with somebody who has cluster B traits, the aftermath kind of feels like it seeps into every part of your system. And this is I wrote down a few things that I noticed myself too, but started to flinch when somebody would text, "Can we talk?" I would say sorry constantly, even when I hadn't done anything wrong. I would over-explain because I was so used to being accused of bad intentions. I'd spiral after a conflict because my nervous system equated disconnection with danger. And I couldn't stop checking social media because I felt responsible for how it ended. And my friends or people close to me would say, he was awful, be glad it's over. My therapist said, I'm so relieved. But I didn't feel glad. I felt guilty, like I failed. And I was wondering if I was the toxic one. And that went on for a while. And a lot of people, when I talk about this now, or, that wasn't my first rodeo. I hope that my rodeos are done now. But when people say, why don't you just leave? Or if you're in this situation and people in your life are saying, why don't you just leave? I'm just going to speak to that for a second, because if you're asking why somebody stays, ask instead why the other person is making leaving feel impossible. Because trauma bonding is not about weakness. I stayed because he made me feel like I couldn't live without him. I stayed because I was managing his feelings, not my own. I stayed because leaving meant losing the version of him I felt for, and admitting to that the version never existed. And I stayed because he said he would fall apart completely if I left. This wasn't just emotional abuse, but it was coercive control. And it's not like my choices were taken away by force, but they were stripped away through manipulation, blame, stonewalling. I didn't lose my freedom overnight. It just felt like it eroded, but it was quiet and it was strategic. And he was convincing me one minute that he wanted to change, but then denying he ever said that the next. Suddenly, it was my fault for expecting too much. I felt like I was just losing my grip on reality because I was. And most people don't realize that they're like being trained to disappear, because we become like groomed to regulate somebody else's moods, or shamed for having boundaries, or praised when we forgave them so easily because we just wanted to move on, but then again blamed for having your own needs. And if you go through thinking that you're too much, what you were starving for was emotional safety, and then being punished for asking for it. And if you're in this loop and you're sitting there and you're like, why do I still miss them? I'll say people ask me that all the time. It's one of the first things people bring up on a clarity call, on an intro call. And I want to tell you what my simple answer is, right? There's a complex answer that relates to your personal story, but I want to give you the simple one, because your body remembers what your brain is trying to forget. You miss the cycle, not the person. You miss the dopamine hit of reconciliation, or the calm after the storm, or the moment of being chosen again. You're not weak. You're trauma bonded. And trauma bonding is not just emotional. It is chemical. And it's that push-pull that rewires your brain. It's why survivors often describe feeling addicted to their abuser. It's why you can know someone is dangerous for you and still want their approval. I used to fantasize about him coming back and saying, I'm sorry. I see what I did. You didn't deserve it. Here's everything I'm going to do to change that behavior in myself. I feel disgusting over how I treated you. But in my case, I never got that apology. What I got was an apology, or what he saw as an apology, in an email that said, I'm sorry for what happened. I finally feel ready to talk. I read one book. And when I said no, because a book isn't intensive therapy, he spiraled, blamed me, and dropped everything off that he had left of mine, which was nothing that I wanted, outside of my apartment building, and had his mom call me. That's not an apology. That's just trying to get me back into the thread of control. And I want to touch on what helped me heal, because it wasn't time, and it's not just moving on, because I am a firm believer that time only heals if you do something with that time. But I had to learn to come back to myself. I made a promise to stop asking myself, was I the problem? And start asking, where did I lose myself in this dynamic? And how would a healthy partner respond? I started to do things like acupuncture to keep things moving in my system. I would document everything because that made me feel like I was gaslighting myself. I did have a coach. I usually always have a coach or a therapist or both. And the hardest and most necessary decision was no contact. I needed to cut up everything, and that included Spotify and Venmo and any place I could see his name. When you are in a relationship with somebody with cluster B traits, the goal is not going to be connection, it's going to be control. And you can see that through all their patterns. They might use language of vulnerability, but underneath it, the driving force is not intimacy. It is the protection of themselves. They don't want to feel the deep, disorganizing shame that lives inside of them. And so they deflect, they blame, and they rewrite reality. They manage their image like it's a lifeline. They really don't have concern or care in how it affects them. So if you're wondering why don't they care, they don't care. And that's why you never got real repair. They couldn't tolerate being wrong, even if it was obvious. That's why every issue somehow became your fault. Admitting that they caused harm could unravel the entire performance of being the good guy, or the victim, or the misunderstood hero. And you were not dealing with somebody who wanted to grow. You're dealing with somebody who wanted to stay in control. And the way that they kept that control was through training you to gaslight yourself, you to question yourself. And to be clear, your reaction to it, your sensitivity, your anger, your anxiety, those are appropriate responses to an unsafe environment. You were having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. You weren't too sensitive. You're just being conditioned to abandon your own perception. I know that if I had stayed in that relationship, or if I'd gone back to it or accepted that he read a book, that loving him would have meant spending years trying to become lovable for someone who was not even capable of meeting me there. I always would have been the person who was wrong, the scapegoat. I couldn't have feelings. I was silenced in this relationship. And I'm not somebody who can be easily silenced at all. But I became silent because he wouldn't listen. So I'd speak to myself, I'd speak to friends, but I wouldn't share how I was feeling with him. And that's not a relationship to me. That feels like that no part of that has the values of the relationship that I would want. Your healing doesn't depend on them changing. It depends on really beginning to see the patterns and start to choose yourself and what you want. It's really hard to ungaslight yourself. And I have a bunch of episodes on that and what that looks like. But ungaslighting yourself begins to take the amount of time that you spend thinking about why do they do something, and it puts it back on you so that you are focusing on what actually happened, not what they said happened, not what they want you to believe happened. If you're listening to this and you're like, I need support here, you can always reach out to me at jessicaknightcoaching.com for coaching offerings, my website, emotionalabusecoach.com. And if there was a book that I would recommend on this, it would be Stop Caretaking the Borderline or Narcissist. It is really good. It is really detailed. And I think it will also be really validating. I hope that this was helpful. And if you want or need support, you can always also head over to my Substack, and the link is below.